Hello, this is Dr. Richard Olivas. This is History 12. And this is, the lecture is titled America's Progressive Era Presidents. More concerned, the thesis statement is, more concerned with regulating economic power than promoting social justice, President Theodore Roosevelt and President Woodrow Wilson dramatically strengthened the office of the president and the power of the executive branch of the federal government during their terms in office. So the main idea here is that these two presidents used the power of the White House and dramatically strengthened the power of the White House in order to bring about reforms that they felt were necessary. First, Theodore Roosevelt becomes the president and inaugurates what he called the Square Deal. Your outline starts by saying that Theodore Roosevelt, or TR, became president when President William McKinley was assassinated in September 1901. President William McKinley was shot in Buffalo, New York, by a self-admitted anarchist, Leon Czolgosz. And McKinley died 8 days later, making Theodore Roosevelt, at the age of 42, the youngest man ever to become president of the United States. As the nation mourned its fallen leader, in many cities, anarchists and others were rounded up for questioning. No one really knew what to expect from Theodore Roosevelt, or TR. Some politicians believed he might be too radical, but others remembered that he suggested in 1894 during the Pullman strike that soldiers fire on the strikers. Nonetheless, under his leadership, progressivism did reshape the national political agenda. Early progressive reformers attacked problems that they saw in their community. They gradually understood, as we saw in the last lecture, that in order to bring about the needed reforms, you needed not just state laws, but you needed federal laws, particularly when large corporations crossed state boundaries in their operations. The emergence of a national industrial economy, as one historian has said, spawned conditions that demanded national solutions. So national problems demand national solutions. And progressive legislation did expand the power of the national government. Progressives at the national level turned their attention to the workings of the economic system. They scrutinized and studied how railroads operated and how other large corporations carried out their businesses. They looked at threats to the natural environment. They looked at the quality of products coming out of American industry. And as they did and carried out these reforms, they vastly expanded the power of the national government. Progressives like TR came to the White House with a lot of credentials. Theodore Roosevelt was, in some ways, the most qualified president we may ever have had in this country. He had a lot of experience before coming to the White House. He had run for mayor of New York. He had served at least one term in the New York State Assembly. He was, for about 4 years, a civil service commissioner, and he was a police commissioner of the city of New York. He also served in the Spanish-American War and had been a capable assistant secretary of the Navy, and he was a governor of New York. And while he was police commissioner and of the city of New York and governor of New York, he had been influenced by a lot of progressives. Jacob Riis, the reformer and advocate for better housing, became one of Roosevelt's friends, and they used to go together on nighttime explorations of the slums and tenements in New York City. Roosevelt had also impressed settlement house workers in New York with his genuine compassion for human misery, his ability to talk to different kinds of people, and even if he didn't understand what was happening, his willingness to learn about social problems. What was he like personally? No one was really sure how he would act. Here are some young people photographed by Jacob Riis. Here's his book, How the Other Half Lives. And then here's a picture, a drawing of Roosevelt and Jacob Riis touring slums together. Go back to this one. Nobody really was sure what he would be like. No one really knew him personally either. He had come from a very wealthy family. He had, growing up, associated and known many wealthy, powerful people around the world. He had written a number of books, was arguably one of the more intellectual presidents since Jefferson. But of course, none of that gave any assurance that he would be a progressive once he was in the White House. But the thing about Roosevelt is that he very much loved being president. He really enjoyed being in the White House. He called his office a bully pulpit, meaning that he could command attention and direct people's energies and reform efforts toward specific problems if he would call attention to them. He had a very appealing personality. He had a good sense of humor, and that made him a good subject for the new mass market magazines and newspapers. Americans adopted him as their favorite. They even they called him Teddy, which he didn't like, and they also named a stuffed bear after him, a teddy bear. Sometimes his exuberance got out of hand. On one occasion, we're told, he took a foreign diplomat on a nude swim in the Potomac River. And an observer remarked, "You have to understand the president is really only 6 years old." But he really was much more than that. He did become much more progressive over time. He revitalized the executive branch of the White House. He reorganized the command structure of the Army. He modernized the consular or foreign service. He made many aspects of the federal government much more efficient. He established the Bureau of Corporations that went on to be very powerful. He appointed a number of independent commissions that were staffed with experts to give him advice on different subjects. And he was able to recruit and train a lot of very capable people to work for the government. As this newspaper clipping from the Washington Post shows us, in 1905, he even summoned to the White House college coaches and college presidents to discuss ways to limit violence in football. But of course, all these efforts notwithstanding, a lot of social justice progressives felt that he didn't go far enough. On one occasion, Florence Kelley was so upset with Roosevelt that she walked out of the Oval Office and slammed the door behind her. However, to his credit, Theodore Roosevelt did listen to the pleas of progressives that he invited to the White House, and he became more progressive over time. Theodore Roosevelt was fearless in many ways and had considerable amounts of courage. One of his first actions as president was to try to control the large industrial corporations. When he took office, he did so in a wave, during a wave of unprecedented business consolidation. Now, for example, between 1897 and 1904, approximately 4,200 companies combined to form 257 large corporations. So there's a lot of consolidation and mergers. U.S. Steel, for example, was formed in 1901 by joining together Carnegie Steel with 8 of its main competitors. In one stroke, that new company controlled probably 2/3 the American refining market. And JP Morgan, we are told, made almost $7 million for supervising the operation or the transaction. During Roosevelt's time, there was a strong outcry for more action against large companies that needed regulation. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was in many ways useless in controlling these large trusts or company aggregations. But muckrakers and progressives called out for new regulation. Roosevelt was not against big business, and he wasn't against people's right to make money. He said in 1902, quote, "Our aim is not to do away with corporations. On the contrary, these big aggregations are the inevitable development of modern industrialism." But he did think that some business people were arrogant and greedy and even irresponsible. And he went on to say, "We draw the line against misconduct, not against wealth." Now, to the shock of many people in the business community, President Roosevelt directed his Attorney General to file suit against the Northern Securities Company, a giant railroad monopoly put together by James Hill and JP Morgan. Morgan came to the White House to tell Roosevelt, quote, "If we have done anything wrong, send your man to my man and they can fix it up." Theodore Roosevelt was furious, and he was determined to let Morgan and other businessmen know that they couldn't deal with him, the President of the United States, as if they were dealing with another business person. It wasn't like that. The government won its case and then went on to prosecute some of the country's largest corporations, including Standard Oil of New Jersey, John D. Rockefeller's company, and the American Tobacco Company. But Roosevelt's antitrust policy did not end the power of these huge corporations. And in some ways, it did not even change how they did business. And consumers were upset that it didn't lower the cost of railroad tickets or cigars or whatever the case may be. But it did breathe new life into the Sherman Antitrust Act, and it did significantly increase the role of the federal government as regulator. The president also strengthened the Interstate Commerce Commission. He, in 1903, steered through Congress the Elkins Act. And then in 1906, the Hepburn Act. Those two laws, the Elkins Act and the Hepburn Act, strengthened the power of the Interstate Commerce Commission. The first law eliminated the use of rebates by railroads. And then the second law gave the ICC more power, and it gave it the right to investigate and enforce railroad rates across the country so that you couldn't have discriminatory or rates or kickbacks. Now, opponents in Congress weakened both of those bills, however, and the legislation did not end abuses, nor did it satisfy the farmers and the small business people who had always been the main critics of the railroad. So there, it's always a work in progress. TR also used the power of the White House and what he called the bully pulpit to mediate, to intervene in important public issues and get settlements. Roosevelt firmly believed in corporate capitalism. He detested socialism. He felt much more comfortable around business executives than he did labor leaders even. but he did view himself as president and saw that he had to intervene in certain issues for the sake of the country. And this is illustrated in 1902 when he intervened in the anthracite coal strike in Pennsylvania and surrounding states. Led by John Mitchell of the United Auto Workers, the United Mine Workers went on strike in 1902. They were protesting low wages, long hours, and unsafe working conditions. In 1901, for example, we know that about 513 coal miners died in industrial accidents. That's more than one a week. Mine owners refused to talk to the striking workers. They hired strike breakers, and they used private security forces to threaten and intimidate workers. And so in the fall of 1902, schools across the country began to close because there was no coal to fire the heaters in the schoolhouses. And it looked like it would be a very, very long, cold winter. Coal, which usually sold for $5 a ton, rose to $14 a ton. So TR called to the White House representatives of the United Mine Workers and the owners, even though the owners swore up and down that they weren't going to talk to these union people. The president appointed a commission. He sat them down. He talked to both sides. Within a few weeks, the miners went back to work with a 10% pay raise, all because he felt it was his obligation to use the power of the White House to intervene during important issues like strikes. This is a political cartoon, The Washington Schoolmaster. President Theodore Roosevelt believed presidential power enabled him to mediate the coal strike of 1902. Roosevelt forced both striking coal miners in Pennsylvania and mine owners to the bargaining table and eventually to a settlement. And here you see him with a stick in his hand that says federal authority. And then you see J.P. Morgan and a railroad owner and two mine owners sitting down as if they're in trouble. And you can see at the top it says primary classroom for coal barons, and at the bottom a book, History, Fate of People Who Thought They Owned the Earth. This is a map that shows, just for our information, early transportation lines to the northern Pennsylvania coal fields. And you can see in the upper right the various coal fields there in this area here. And then on the left, you can see here it says northern coal field, and then middle coal field, southern coal field. So Pennsylvania is is a state with a lot of coal, where a lot of the striking was taking place. This is a picture of Theodore Roosevelt in Allentown, Pennsylvania, some years later. Roosevelt received strong support from residents of Allentown, Pennsylvania, many of whom may have worked as coal miners and would have received increased wages because of the president's intervention in the 1902 coal strike, and he was greatly beloved in Pennsylvania. Point 2. TR meat inspection, pure food and drugs. TR's first, remember TR refers to Theodore Roosevelt, it's just a shorthand for his name. TR's first major legislative reform began almost by accident in 1904, when Upton Sinclair, a 26-year-old muckraking journalist, started doing research on stockyards in Chicago. Born in Baltimore, Upton Sinclair had grown up in New York, and he wrote what were called dime novels to pay his way through City College of New York. He was converted to socialism by his reading and by associating with a group of idealistic young writers in New York. He didn't know a great deal about Chicago, but he was driven by a desire to expose the exploitation of the poor and the oppressed in American factories and stockyards. So he moved to Chicago. He lived at the Settlement House at the University of Chicago while he did research. He conducted interviews and wrote a story that would be published in 1906 under the title The Jungle. Sinclair's novel told about the Rutgers family who immigrated from Lithuania in Eastern Europe to Chicago, filled with ambition and hope, but the American dream failed for the Rutgers family. In his fictionalized account, Sinclair documented how workers were exploited, but it was his description of contaminated meat that got people's attention. He described spoiled hams treated with formaldehyde and sausages that were made from meat scraps, rats, and other refuse. He hoped to convert his readers to socialism, but Sinclair instead turned people's stomachs away from, turned their stomachs and then caused a public outcry for better regulation of the meatpacking industry. President Roosevelt was very upset by what he read and heard. That book, The Jungle, sold 25,000 copies in the first 6 weeks, and it disturbed a lot of people, including TR, who, it was reported, could no longer enjoy his breakfast sausage, knowing what might be in it. So TR, outraged, ordered a study of the meatpacking industry, and then used the report in the progressive tradition to pressure Congress and the meatpackers to accept a bill introduced by a senator from Indiana named Albert Beveridge, who was a progressive. And in the end, the Meat Inspection Act of 1906 was a compromise. It enforced some federal inspection and mandated sanitary conditions in all companies that sold meat in interstate commerce or across state lines. Meat packers defeated a provision in the bill that would have required them to date all meat and put a label when it was produced. Some of the large companies supported the bill, the compromise bill, because it gave them an advantage in their battle with smaller companies. Here's a picture of Upton Sinclair. Here's a movie poster of the film version of The Jungle. Here's a picture of the stockyards at Packingtown, the large district on the south side of Chicago where the livestock or animals were kept in pens. This is a photograph titled, a close-up titled, "In the Heart of the Great Union Stockyards, Chicago." And so animals are raised or fed in many parts of the country, and they're taken on trains to these stockyards. They're put into the stockyards, and then they're slaughtered there. This is a panoramic picture illustrating the beef industry from 1900. It's a little hard to see, but you can sort of see the steps of the slaughterhouse. This photograph is called "Floorers Removing the Hides from Cattle." After the cattle are killed, you have to take off the hide or the outer skin so that you can get to the meat inside. This is titled "Chicago Meat Inspectors 1906, Splitting Backbones and Final Inspection, Hogs Ready for the Cooler." So, and if you look at that wood up there above the, it already looks pretty unsanitary, but here you see the meat inspectors in their white coats. Here's Theodore Roosevelt muckraking his way by investigations through the meatpacking industry, holding his nose. This is a statement from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Food Safety and Inspection Service, commenting on the Federal Meat Inspection Act. The Federal Meat Inspection Act established 4 major sanitary requirements for the meatpacking industry. It required mandatory inspection of livestock before they were slaughtered. It required mandatory post-mortem inspection of every carcass. You have to inspect them after they're killed. And then it set explicit sanitary standards for slaughterhouses, and then allowed the U.S. Department of Agriculture to issue grants of inspection and monitor slaughter and processing operations. Following passage of the 1906 Act, the Meat Inspection Division hired more than 1,300 inspectors to carry out inspection activities at 163 different factories. In 1907, it employed more than 2,200 inspectors at approximately 700 establishments. Another reform effort undertaken by Theodore Roosevelt had to do with regulating the sale of pure food and drugs. In particular, Theodore Roosevelt wanted the power of the White House, the power of the government, to regulate the sale of food and drugs. One of the president's targets were what were called patent medicines. A lot of reformers, taking advantage of the publicity surrounding the jungle, tried to bring about reform of the sale of food and drugs. Now, Americans consumed a lot of what were called patent medicines. And I want to give a definition of what a patent medicine is. It's actually a medicine under a patent that the US government issues to protect the formulation. Patent medicine, according to the Webster's Third Dictionary, New International Dictionary, patent medicine is a packaged non-prescription drug or medicine of secret composition protected by a trademark. Sometimes patent medicine is known as proprietary medicine. Patent medicines, so-called, were privately mixed or formulated. Their ingredients were not listed on the package, and they were not regulated by the federal government. Often they provided relief because they might contain opiates. Here's an example of a few of the little more flamboyant, incredible patent medicines. This one is called, the government issued a patent for a formulation of Bonor's electromagnetic bathing fluid. This patent medicine, as you can see, claimed to cure many ailments, even serious illnesses, but it did not list its secret proprietary ingredients, nor was this product regulated by the US government. And you can see there that it says that it will cure, to some of the more serious ones, cholera, paralysis, measles, epilepsy, scarlet fever. And these are strong claims, but of course there's no proof whatsoever that they had to do this because they weren't regulated. Here's another one, Clark Stanley's snake oil liniment. This patent medicine claimed to cure many ailments, but its formulation, while trademarked, was made up of unknown ingredients. It was not regulated by the US government. You can see that it says used external only, but it cures rheumatism, sciatica, lumbago, toothache. I'm not sure how you would cure a toothache by using it externally or outside your cheek. I'm not sure. Frostbites, sore throat, same problem there. Animal bites, good for man and beast. It gives immediate relief. But it's not regulated. Nobody knows what's in it. So there's no, if it doesn't work, you can't, I guess you could take it back and get your money. I'm not sure, but this is a pretty incredible kind of medicine. This illustration, or this piece of evidence, is taken from the cover of Collier's magazine. And in Death Laboratory, E.W. Kimball, expose of patent medicine fraud, the author wrote this: patent medicines are poisoning people throughout America today. Babies who cry are fed laudanum under the name of syrup. Women are led to injure themselves for life by reading in the papers about the meaning of headache. Young men and boys are robbed and contaminated by vicious criminals who lure them to their dens through seductive advertisements. Laudanum is an alcoholic solution containing morphine, prepared from opium and formerly used as a narcotic painkiller. So babies were given morphine, it turns out, but if you bought the packaging, you wouldn't know that because the ingredients aren't listed. On June the 30th, 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt signed the Food and Drugs Act, known simply as the Wiley Act, a pillar of the progressive era. This law, which the Bureau of Chemistry was charged to administer, prohibited the interstate transport of unlawful food and drugs under penalty of seizure of the questionable products and or prosecution of the responsible parties. The basis of the law rested on the regulation of product labeling rather than pre-market approval. Now today, drugs are tested and then given approval before they're put on the market. The main regulation here at the time was that manufacturers had to state on the label what was inside the product. But even this, of course, you can see, was an important step forward. A third area of concern where the president used the power of the White House and the federal government to bring about progressive reform was in the environmental issues. Now, President Roosevelt was very pleased with the legislation for regulating food and drugs and Meat Inspection Act, but he always considered his conservation program his most important domestic achievement. President Roosevelt was an outdoorsman, a hunter, an amateur naturalist ever since his youth. And after he became president, he announced that he planned to protect the nation's forests and our water resources, and that would be one of his vital concerns. Using executive authority that the president has, President Roosevelt more than tripled the amount of land set aside for national forests, bringing the total at the end of his term to almost 150 million acres. He was also very concerned about water. President Roosevelt traveled widely in the Western states, and he understood, as a lot of people from the East didn't, that there were problems created by limited water. Now, in 1902, with his enthusiastic support, Congress passed the Newlands Act, named after Francis Newlands, a U.S. congressman from the state of Nevada, who was a very strong supporter of this measure because Nevada, as you know, has very little water. The law was called the National Reclamation Act, and it set aside the proceeds from the sale of public land in 16 Western states and territories to pay for the construction of irrigation projects in those states. So states were allowed to sell public lands inside their state boundaries and then use the proceeds to create large irrigation systems to take water to dry areas so they could become farming land. That law probably helped big farmers more than it helped little ones, but the Newlands Act is also very important because it federalized irrigation for the first time. That is, it made irrigation a federal issue. So thus we see the power of the federal government growing once again. Now, while we're on the issue of water, it's important to understand Theodore Roosevelt's philosophy and see how it differed in some ways from the philosophy of others that are also concerned about the environment. Now, Theodore Roosevelt was what we call a conservationist. But his main, sometimes ally and sometimes adversary, named John Muir, was a preservationist. So let's define these terms. First of all, conservation means to save, to manage, or to control the use of a natural resource. Preservation means to keep something in its original state or condition, allowing no use of it. So conservationists would allow federal lands to be used by farmers to graze animals. It would be, conservationists would allow lumber companies to do selective logging or cutting in US forest areas and things like that. But preservationists would not. Now, Theodore Roosevelt was a conservationist. And during his presidency, he tried to implement his point of view in national policy. He hired as an advisor a man named Gifford Pinchot. Gifford Pinchot. Pinchot was probably the strongest advocate of conservation in the United States, and he became a friend and a close advisor of TR. Pinchot believed in selective logging. He believed in controlled burns, or burning forest areas, or what sometimes was called fire control. And he also believed in limited grazing on public lands. Those policies pleased many people in the timber or the lumber industry and the cattle industry, but a lot of people were angered by this. President Roosevelt's conservationist policies were strongly denounced by the followers of John Muir, the man in this photograph on the right side. John Muir was a preservationist, and he believed very passionately in keeping or preserving land in its original wilderness condition. John Muir had founded the Sierra Club in 1862, if I'm not mistaken, and he had led a successful campaign to create Yosemite National Park in California. You can see here in this picture, he had a shaggy beard. He had these blue work clothes and sort of a slouch hat. He seemed like an eccentric person to many, but thousands agreed with him because he argued, according to one historian of the wilderness in the West, that Muir believed that to preserve the American wilderness was a spiritual and psychological necessity for over-civilized and overstimulated urban dwellers. So, in other words, people like Muir believed that urban residents needed to go back to nature to get in touch with themselves. Muir was one of the leaders of the so-called Back to Nature movement at the turn of the century. And it was during this time that many middle-class Americans took up hiking, camping, and other outdoor activities. A lot of children joined groups like the Boy Scouts. I think they were founded in 1910, Campfire Girls, things like that. One dramatic way to demonstrate the different philosophies of these two men and to demonstrate the differences between a conservationist and a preservationist is by looking at the Hetch Hetchy affair. The Hetch Hetchy affair. Now, Hetch Hetchy was a valley deep inside or deep within Yosemite National Park. Here you can see a picture from the early 1900s of Hetch Hetchy, the valley. And it's beautiful, as you can see. There's a waterfall in the upper left there, and it was a very pristine wilderness area, and Muir and his followers wanted to keep it like that. But in 1901, the mayor of San Francisco decided that the valley would make a perfect place for a dam and a reservoir to supply his growing city with water for decades to come. Muir argued that to build a dam and to flood Hetch Hetchy was a serious mistake, and that he said the wilderness would one day be more rare or more scarce than even water itself. And he said that the places like Hetch Hetchy were necessary for the moral, what he called the moral fiber of the country. So Pinchot, on the other hand, the president's advisor, said it was foolish to pander to the aesthetic enjoyment of just a tiny group of people when the comfort and welfare of the great majority of people was at stake. In other words, water was more important than a beautiful view. This Hetch Hetchy affair was fought out in the newspapers and the magazines of the country and the halls of Congress, and in the end, the conservationists won out. Eventually, the dam was built, turning that valley into a lake, but of course, that debate continues. Here's a picture of Hetch Hetchy from the dam that was built, and you can see. Let's go back. You can see how deep the valley is, and you can see how much water is there now. This is a map, a very helpful map, that shows the length of, or the distance from Hetch Hetchy to San Francisco. Here we're looking at about, if I'm not mistaken, about 170 miles. That's how long the aqueduct is that carries the water from Hetch Hetchy to San Francisco. Now, as we said at the outset, the president and the progressive era presidents, particularly Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, they were more concerned with regulating economic power than promoting social justice. And we can see the limitations of the progressive movement and in the of many in the progressive movement. We can see the limitations of these progressive era presidents in racial questions. Now, like a lot of people of his time, Theodore Roosevelt thought in stereotyped racial terms. He believed that certain people were socially inferior, and he believed that these massive migrations into the United States from Southern and Eastern Europe threatened Anglo-Saxon dominance. But Roosevelt was a politician, and he did make gestures of goodwill to different groups of people. As we know, he even invited Booker T. Washington to the White House in 1901, because most American blacks at this time were still loyal to the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln. But Theodore Roosevelt took a lot of criticism from Southerners for allowing Booker T. Washington to sit at the table, as the same table as the president, in 1901. Roosevelt did appoint qualified Black Americans to minor federal posts, like Dr. William Cruitt to head the Customs House in Charleston in 1905. He also made appointments in the Justice Department and so on. But at other times, Theodore Roosevelt seemed very insensitive to the needs and feelings of Black Americans. We know this was especially true in how he handled the Brownsville affair in 1906 in southeastern Texas. A riot took place there, a shooting took place. Black soldiers from Fort Brown were blamed. A lot of people believe still that the clips and rifles that were used to incriminate the black soldiers for the shootings were planted. Roosevelt waited till the election was over of 1906 and then ordered that 167 black soldiers every one of whom had served with distinction, be dishonorably discharged from the military. And that was an unjust punishment. The crime was never proven. And it wasn't until for 66 years, President Richard Nixon ordered that they be honorably discharged. And if I'm not mistaken, only one of them was still alive when that injustice was rectified. It's important to remember that the progressive era, the progressive period, coincided or took place during the same years as the greatest segregation in the South took place. And even the most reformed, the most progressive reformers were not really conscious of Black questions. Hull House, for example, like most social settlements, was segregated. Although Jane Addams clearly did what she could to overcome racist attitudes of her day, she did found a settlement in Black Chicago. She spoke out repeatedly against lynching. She was a founding member of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. But progressives could be limited in their social involvement with questions having to do with race. Now, this point has to do with the founding of the NAACP. The founding of the NAACP is very important in its own right, but it's also important because a number of white progressives were involved in its founding. Now, this is a picture of Booker T. Washington, who was president of Tuskegee Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama. Now, first of all, in the early 20th century, there was a strong division within the Black community as to the best way to prepare young Blacks for the future and how to get rid of Jim Crow or racial segregation. Booker T. Washington believed that the best way for Blacks to help themselves was by getting a trade or a skill in what was called industrial or mechanical education. This is a picture of Tuskegee Institute, and of which he was president, in a panoramic picture here. And this entire institution was dedicated to industrial mechanical training. It would be like giving, encouraging students in the Los Angeles Community College District to go to our school downtown, Los Angeles Trade and Technical Institute, to learn how to become a welder or an electrician or a plumber, something like that. These are young men in a class at Tuskegee, taking a class in farm management, learning how to administrate the workings of a farm. This is a brick making factory on the Tuskegee campus, and many of the buildings at Tuskegee were built with bricks made on that very campus. This is an outline of Booker T. Washington's philosophy, or the gospel of success, as he called it. The first step in progress for Black Americans, or really Native Americans and others, was to get a skill or a trade. Then, getting a skill or a trade would lead to upward progress, more money, more responsibility, perhaps even buying a house. That in turn, that progress and that moving up in society would lead to social acceptance by whites. That is, whites would accept hardworking, diligent Black Americans. And then the social acceptance of them would lead, Booker T. Washington believed, to racial harmony without protest and agitation. Many Blacks accepted at least part of this philosophy, certainly the first two parts, although it became clear over time that the last two parts weren't really true. That is, competitive, upwardly mobile blacks many times were attacked because they were seen as competitors for jobs. Another kind of philosophy was put forward by this man, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois was born in a small town in Massachusetts, was raised in an environment in which he didn't have a lot of overt or hardcore segregation. And he was highly educated. He was the first Black American to receive a PhD at Harvard and went on to graduate study in Germany. Booker T. Washington believed that it was the responsibility of the talented 10th, the educated, socially elite group of Black Americans, to lift up the 90%, if you will. And this is a quote from Du Bois from 1903, quote, "Work alone will not do it unless inspired by the right ideals and guided by intelligence. Education must not simply teach work, it must teach life. The talented 10th of the Negro race must be made leaders of thought and missionaries of culture among people. No others can do this work. And Negro colleges must train men for it. The Negro race, like all other races, is going to be saved by its exceptional men. The problem of education, then, among Negroes must first of all deal with the talented 10th. It is the problem of developing the best of this race, that they may guide the mass away from the contamination and death of the worst in their own and other races." So here he's focusing on the solution to Jim Crow and racial inequality in the country is to train the highly educated to teach differently and to teach the talented 10th so they can go and lead the rest of the race into equality. Now, Du Bois founded in 1905 the Niagara Movement. Here's a picture of the first meeting of the Niagara Movement. This group is important because Du Bois is trying to find his way philosophically to confront Jim Crow in the South. And it was here that he developed what was called a Black agenda. And so at first, the Niagara Movement membership in it was limited to Blacks only, not because he was a separatist, but because he wanted Blacks to think through these questions and come up with an agenda of their own. And this is a strong statement that he issued in 1905 at the end of the Niagara Movement's first meeting. Quote, "We repudiate the monstrous doctrine that the oppressor should be the sole authority as to the rights of the oppressed." These are very, very strong words, of course. Now, within a few years, the Niagara Movement failed. It sort of broke apart, partly because of attacks from without by Booker T. Washington, and also there was disagreement within. Some of the members didn't get along with Du Bois, and there were internal disagreements. So the important next step in the Black freedom struggle was the founding of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Now, the NAACP was founded shortly after this incident. What you see here are pictures of a riot in Springfield, Illinois. Illinois, of course, is a northern state, and Springfield has symbolic importance because it's the birthplace of Abraham Lincoln. And this was a terrible riot that took place in Springfield. You can see here some of the destruction afterward. The destroyed sites being inspected. And when that happened, this man, Oswald Garrison Villard, from New York, but a grandson of the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, Oswald Garrison Villard believed it was important to gather people together to try to found a group to protect Black Americans, because many Americans believe that racial violence was something limited to the South, but when it happens in the North, it's becoming a national problem. So William Lloyd Garrison's grandson wanted to try to help and stop this. In 1909, they founded, he and others, an interracial group, founded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. W.B. Du Bois of the Niagara Movement became the editor of the Crisis. Here he is in his office at the NAACP, and here's the first issue of the Crisis, the journal of the NAACP. And these are words printed in the Crisis. Agitate then, brother, protest, reveal the truth, and refuse to lie silent. A moment's let up, a moment's acquiescence means a chance for the wolves of prejudice to get at our necks, unquote. These are not the cautious words of Booker T. Washington. This is a very different approach. As one famous historian of Black America said, by 1915, the NAACP's aggressive campaign for civil and political rights replaced Washington's strategy of progress through conciliation and accommodation. So like two ships passing in the night, the NAACP's strategy becomes the main strategy. The main strategy, at least, to confront racial inequality in the United States. Now, the last point in this lecture has to do with Teddy Roosevelt leaving the White House. Now, after 2 terms as president, Theodore Roosevelt decided to step down. Now, at that time, of course, there were no limits on how many terms a president could serve. You could run as many times and serve if you want. Roosevelt said this: I believe in a strong executive. I believe in power, but I believe the responsibility should go with power. And that it is not well that the strong executive should be a perpetual executive. So he stepped down. But it didn't take long for him to regret that decision. When TR stepped down, I believe he was only 50 years old, and he was probably at the peak of his popularity and power. So he didn't, our system of government doesn't really have a lot of formal function for ex-presidents. So he went big game hunting in Africa and things like that. But before he left, he handpicked his successor. His successor, his favorite, was William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft was Roosevelt's personal choice for the Republican nomination for president in 1908. William Howard Taft was incredibly well qualified. He was a distinguished lawyer. He was a federal judge. He was a public servant. He was born in Cincinnati. He had been the first civilian governor of the Philippines, and he had been Secretary of War under Theodore Roosevelt. Now, in 1908, he defeated William Jennings Bryan for the White House, but he started to run into difficulties right away. The ironic thing was that William Howard Taft, in a lot of ways, was more progressive than Theodore Roosevelt. His administration, Taft's administration, instituted more lawsuits against monopolies in 1 term than Roosevelt had done in 2. He supported the 8-hour workday. He agreed that with laws that would make mining safer, and he tried to strengthen the Interstate Commerce Commission by giving it jurisdiction over the new telephone and telegraph companies. Taft and Congress also authorized the first tax on corporate profits. And he also encouraged the process that eventually led to the passage of the 16th Amendment, which was ratified in 1913, creating the federal income tax for the first time. That one law, the federal income tax, in the words of one historian, probably did more to transform the relationship of the government to the people than all other progressive measures combined. That is, the federal income tax greatly strengthened the power of the federal government. William Howard Taft's problem, biggest problem, was his style. In a way, he was a large man. Some say that he weighed more than 350 pounds. There were rumors, not proof, but there were rumors that circulated saying that he had to have a special oversized bathtub installed at the White House. He was sort of an uninspiring speaker. People made fun of the way he talked. And he didn't have a lot of the political skills that Theodore Roosevelt had. Even Theodore Roosevelt himself was infuriated when President Taft reversed many of Roosevelt's own conservation policies. And then Taft fired Gifford Pinchot, who was the chief forester of the United States. And Roosevelt formally broke with William Howard Taft, and then he let it be known that he was going to run again for president in 1912. So that election set up one of the most exciting candidates, one of the most exciting elections in American history. There were four candidates. There was William Howard Taft, who was a sitting president, Theodore Roosevelt, an ex-president who now was running against Taft, and then Woodrow Wilson was the nominee for the Democratic Party, and then Eugene Debs was a socialist. Now, Woodrow Wilson went on to win that nomination, the election, because the Democrats were divided, the Republicans were divided. So Wilson wins the White House because Taft and Roosevelt split the Republican vote. Wilson was the son and the grandson of a Presbyterian preacher. He was from the South. He received a PhD from Princeton, and he was the president of Princeton University. It seemed like he was going to be a very, very progressive president based on his background. Here's the results of the election in 1912. All the states in blue went for Wilson. Wilson, of course, won overwhelmingly because the Republicans divided. Here is a quote from W.B. Du Bois before the election occurred, published in The Crisis. Du Bois said this: Woodrow Wilson is a cultivated scholar and he has brains. We have therefore a conviction that Mr. Wilson will treat black men and their interests with far-sighted fairness. He will not advance the cause of oligarchy in the South. He will not see further means of Jim Crow insult. He will not dismiss black men wholesale from office, and he will remember that the Negro in the United States has a right to be heard and considered. But Du Bois was approving of Wilson and encouraged blacks to leave the Republican Party and vote for Wilson merely because, or largely because, Woodrow Wilson was highly educated. Shortly after Woodrow Wilson took the White House, he issued orders that the Treasury and Post Office departments be segregated. Here's a comment, a letter to Woodrow Wilson in the page of The Crisis from William Monroe Trotter, a newspaper publisher and journalist. William Monroe Trotter to Woodrow Wilson: Sir, you have now been president of the United States for 6 months, and what is the result? It is no exaggeration to say that every enemy of the Negro race is greatly encouraged. Public segregation of civil servants in government employment, necessarily involving personal insult and humiliation, has for the first time in history been made the policy of the United States government. in the Treasury and Post Office departments, colored clerks have been herded to themselves as though they were not human beings. We are told that one colored clerk who could not be segregated on account of the nature of his work has consequently had a cage built around him to separate him from his white companions of many years. Mr. Wilson, do you know these things? There's a picture of a segregated waiting room at the U.S. Public Health Service the year after Woodrow Wilson wins a second term. To conclude, this lecture began by talking about America's progressive era presidents. The thesis statement was that Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt before him were more concerned with regulating economic power than promoting social justice. And to do that, to bring about these reforms, Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson dramatically strengthened the office of president in the executive branch of the federal government during their terms in office. In other words, to bring about these national reforms in a national economy, the power of the federal government was used to do it. So government power grows significantly during this period. Thank you very much for your attention.